The security guard held the glass door open the way you'd hold a door for someone leaving a restaurant, polite, neutral, and completely empty, while a 27-year-old woman, 7 months pregnant, stepped out into a February night in Boston, with nothing but a thin coat from a clearance rack and a plastic bag that held the results of a prenatal checkup her insurance had just refused to cover. She wasn't crying. She was too cold to cry. Behind the glass, a nurse who'd watched the whole thing tucked herself behind the reception desk like the counter could hide what she'd just allowed to happen. A man in the waiting room who'd held the elevator for her 10 minutes earlier was now staring at his phone with the focused intensity of someone who didn't want to be present for what was happening 3 feet from him. And in the basement parking garage, engine off, windows so dark you couldn't see inside even if you pressed your face to the glass, sat a black Escalade that belonged to a man who could have bought the entire maternity ward with cash, and still had enough left over to buy the silence of everyone in the building. He was 36. He ran the south side of this city, the way some men run corporations quietly, precisely, and with the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice. He hadn't come to this hospital for her. He didn't know her name. He'd come for a meeting on the top floor, the kind that happened in rooms with no windows and left no paper trail. But when he stepped out of the private elevator and saw her through the glass wall of the lobby, one hand on her stomach, snow settling on her shoulders like the city was slowly trying to bury her, he stopped. Not because he was kind. He wasn't kind. He stopped because 30 years ago, he'd been a 6-year-old boy sitting on concrete steps outside a locked apartment door in South Boston, and every single person who'd walked past him that night had decided he wasn't their problem. He pushed through the glass door. He walked straight to where she was standing. She looked up and saw the kind of man that every instinct told her to step away from: tall, dark coat, cold eyes, the kind of face that didn't ask for permission. She stepped back. He took off his coat. $4,000 of black cashmere, tailored in Milan, the kind of coat his mother hadn't touched anything close to in her entire life, and he draped it over the shoulders of a stranger. And then he walked back inside the hospital. And what he did next is something no one in that building could have predicted. If this story already got you, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like if you believe people still stop for strangers, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a 6-year-old boy, a locked door, and a woman in a laundromat who changed everything with a cup of cocoa and 5 words he'd never forget. Connell Sheridan grew up in South Boston, in a 3rd-floor apartment in an Irish-American working-class building where only one side of the hallway lights ever worked, and the stairs always smelled of old cigarettes mixed with cheap bleach. His father's name was Glenn Sheridan, a man Connell could remember only in scattered pieces: the smell of beer on a shirt, late-night laughter when friends came over, and a pair of brown shoes always left beside the front door. Glenn owed gambling money to a local organization, the kind of debt where people didn't send reminder letters. They sent men to knock on your door. The night Connell was 5 years old, just weeks after his winter birthday, there was a knock. Not an ordinary knock, but the kind of knock that happens only once, and after it, everything is different. Ruth carried Connell into the back room, set him on his bed, told him to lie still, then closed the bedroom door. As an only child, Connell would spend the quiet, cold years that followed navigating the heavy shadows of South Boston alongside his mother. When she opened that door again, Glenn was no longer in the apartment. His coat was still hanging on the hook. His brown shoes were still by the door. His keys were still on the kitchen table, but Glenn was gone, as if someone had lifted him out of the room without touching a single thing he owned. Ruth didn't call the police. She didn't call anyone. She locked the door with both bolts, for the first time since they'd moved in. The next morning, she started working double shifts at the textile mill. Within 48 hours, she put away everything that belonged to Glenn: his shirts, his shoes, his photographs, his shaving mug. All of it vanished, as if he'd never been there at all. There was only one thing Ruth didn't put away. The folding knife with the oak handle lay in the drawer of the bedside table, its steel blade already a little dull. The initials G.S. carved into the handle. Ruth didn't keep it because she missed Glenn. Ruth kept it because the knife could still be used. And Ruth didn't throw away anything that could still be used. From that night on, Ruth worked the night shift at the textile mill, from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. She got home in time to make breakfast for Connell before he went to school: eggs and toast if there were eggs, oatmeal if there weren't. Then she slept 4 hours, woke up, did the housework, and repeated it all. for 20 straight years. Her hands grew thick around the knuckles and rough across the palms, always carrying the faint smell of industrial soap, no matter how many times she washed them at home. The night Connell was 6 years old, Ruth was working the night shift. Mr. Morris, the neighbor on the same floor, was paid $20 a week by Ruth to watch the two children starting at 9 o'clock at night. But that day, Mr. Morris was drunk and forgot to open the door for Connell when the boy came home from a friend's house at 7 o'clock in the evening. The door was locked. Connell knocked. No one opened. He sat down on the concrete step outside the third-floor apartment door. It was December. The hallway had no heat. The window at the far end of the corridor had a broken corner, and the wind slipped through it carrying a cold that a 6-year-old body didn't yet know how to endure. He sat there for 3 hours, his backpack on his lap, his hands tucked into the pockets of his thin coat. Mrs. Henderson from the 4th floor walked past, looked at him, looked at the closed door, and kept going. The young couple from the 2nd floor stepped over him as if stepping over a pair of shoes someone had left outside. The pizza delivery man glanced at him once, then kept climbing the stairs. 3 hours. 4 people passing by, and no one stopped. Not until the woman who owned the laundromat on the 1st floor closed late because one of the washing machines had jammed. She came up the stairs and saw the little boy sitting curled into himself, backpack on his lap, eyes open but no longer really seeing anything. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask where his parents were. She led him downstairs into the laundromat, sat him on a plastic chair beside a running dryer, and the warmth and noise of that dryer were the kindest things he'd felt in those 3 hours. She made him a cup of cocoa from an almost empty tin of powder, using hot water from the sink faucet. Not milk, because she didn't have milk in the laundromat. Then she said 5 words. No kid should sit alone. No more questions. No need for more. Ruth arrived at 11 o'clock that night. When she opened the laundromat door and saw her son sitting beside the dryer with a cold cup of cocoa in his hands, her face wasn't horrified. It was confirmation, the face of a woman who had always known the world would do this to her child, only not when. The laundromat owner moved away 6 months later. Connell never learned her name, but 30 years later, he still remembered the noisy dryer, the cup of cocoa made with tap water, and those 5 words. He didn't remember them like a memory. He remembered them the way the body remembers temperature, knowing exactly what cold felt like, and knowing exactly the moment someone gave him warmth. When Connell was 14 years old, he saw a man being beaten in front of the liquor store at the end of the block. He went home and asked Ruth whether they should call the police. Ruth looked at her son, stayed quiet for a long while, then said, "You don't need to save everyone. You only need to know when you're looking away, because that other place, the place you look toward instead, you'll have to live there forever." Connell was 19 years old when he learned the truth about his father. Not from Ruth, not from the police, but from a drunk in a bar in Southie on a Saturday night, while Connell was washing glasses for the evening shift. The man looked at the name on the employee payroll sheet taped behind the counter, narrowed his eyes as he read it, then asked, "Sheridan? Any relation to Glenn Sheridan?" Connell said that was his father. The drunk looked at him for a moment and laughed, the kind of laugh a man gives when he doesn't know he's holding a knife. Glenn Sheridan? Owed Keene 20,000. Probably lying at the bottom of the harbor by now, kid. Connell set the glass down on the counter. It didn't break. His hand didn't shake. He just set it down and stood still. For 15 years, he'd thought his father had left. For 15 years, he'd carried the feeling of being abandoned the way he carried the cold in his bones from that night on the stairway, something that had soaked in and never come out. But his father hadn't left. His father had been taken. His father owed money to the kind of people who didn't send letters demanding payment, and they came one January night and carried him away. His shoes were still by the door. His coat was still on the hook. The folding knife was still in the drawer. Connell didn't go home that night. He walked from the bar to the harbor, stood looking at the black water for 40 minutes, and understood something he'd never forget. A person without power is the person sitting on the stairs, waiting for someone to open the door. The person who owes money and has no way to pay it back. The 6-year-old boy watching people walk past him without stopping. Connell decided he would never sit on any staircase again. He would be the one holding the keys. He started at the bottom, collecting protection money for a lieutenant in Southie, driving, making deliveries, doing the things no one looked him in the eye while handing over. He wasn't fast, and he wasn't reckless, but he was patient. In a way, very few men in this world are patient. The kind of patience that belongs to someone who once sat waiting for 3 hours in a cold hallway and learned that waiting is a skill, if you know what you're waiting for. 17 years later, Connell Sheridan, 36 years old, controlled South Boston. Loan sharking, protection, real estate, a chain of restaurants used as fronts, and money flowing each quarter through a charity fund washed clean at the private St. Clement's Hospital. He lived in a penthouse in the Seaport District, in the new construction area, all glass and steel. 10 minutes by car from South Boston, but a whole lifetime away from South Boston. The apartment had minimalist furnishings, not because of style, but because Connell had grown up in a home where everything belonging to one man vanished in a single night, and he'd learned that owning less meant losing less. A dining table with 6 chairs, but only one ever used. A refrigerator stocked with only what was necessary. On the nightstand was the book Ruth sent him every Christmas, a different one each year, and he read every one of them, not because he loved reading, but because that was Ruth's way of saying your mother is still thinking of you, without ever needing to say it out loud. The folding knife with the oak handle, the initials G, S, had been in the left pocket of his suit jacket for 17 years. The blade had gone dull because he never sharpened it. Sharpening it would mean intending to use it, and he had no such intention. It was there not because of Glenn, but because it was proof that something left behind still didn't disappear. Paxton Greer, 42 years old, underboss, was the man who managed everything Connell didn't want to touch with his own hands. Paxton didn't solve things with emotion. He solved them with numbers. Every debt, every deal, every promise was written in a black-covered ledger Paxton kept with him, never digitized, because digitized meant evidence. In that ledger, there was a separate section recording every time Connell went soft. In the year 2022, forgiving the debt of the grocery store owner on Dot Ave, $8,000. In the year 2023, giving another 3 months to a debtor who had just had a newborn child, $12,000 in lost interest. In the year 2024, dropping protection on a laundromat in Southie after Connell looked at it and said, "Let it pass," in a voice Paxton had never heard before. Paxton wrote it all down. He said nothing. Every line in that ledger was a brick, and Paxton was building a wall he would use to lock Connell inside on the exact day he needed it. Then there was Briggs, 38 years old, Connell's driver for 12 years, a man so quiet people often forgot he was in the room. Briggs was the only one who knew Connell called Ruth every Thursday night, the only one who had seen Connell sitting in the car at 3 o'clock in the morning after a long night, going nowhere, saying nothing, just looking through the windshield at the city darkening around him as if he were searching for something he didn't know how to name. Briggs didn't ask. Briggs drove. That was all Briggs did, and that was all Connell needed. While Connell Sheridan was sitting in his Seaport District penthouse with Paxton's black-covered ledger, recording every debt and every time he'd gone soft, 9 kilometers south of him, in Dorchester, there was a woman named Faye Hollis sitting on the bed in a 28-square-meter studio that cost $1,100 a month, counting every coin in the old tin box on top of the refrigerator. Faye was 27 years old, a final-year nursing intern, 7 months pregnant, and she knew the price of every kind of canned beans at Market Basket, down to the very last cent. She knew Tuesday was the day the supermarket marked down bread that was close to expiring. She knew that if she bought store-brand peanut butter instead of the name brand, she could save $2.60 a week, and $2.60 multiplied by 4 weeks was $10.40, and $10.40 was a round-trip bus ride to the hospital for a prenatal checkup. She lived by arithmetic. $34,000 in student debt, $120 a week for food, rent, electricity, bus fare, insurance. Each expense was a number, and each number was a string, and Faye was balancing on all of them at once with the hands of someone who had grown used to living without a net underneath her. Troy Egan, 29 years old, the baby's father, was the kind of man who disappeared layer by layer instead of all at once. When the ultrasound confirmed the baby was a girl, Troy's texts began getting shorter. His calls came less often. His plans grew dimmer, until one day, Faye's phone stopped lighting up with his name, and she understood that Troy had been leaving piece by piece for weeks, and she had watched it happen, the way a person watches weather moving in from the horizon, knowing it's coming, unable to do anything but stand still where she is. But Troy hadn't only left. Before he vanished, he had borrowed $15,000 at heavy interest from Connell's organization through Paxton Greer, and to get that loan, Troy had listed Faye Hollis as his financial dependent on his paperwork. Faye didn't know. She didn't know her name was sitting in a black-covered ledger on the other side of the city, didn't know her credit file was carrying a red flag she had never created, didn't know that red flag was quietly freezing her health insurance inside the system without anyone ever telling her in a human voice, only through error codes and the words processing every time she called the insurance company. Faye's mother, Nadine Hollis, 54 years old, had worked as an emergency room nurse for 15 years. The community hospital in Dorchester where she worked had shut down years ago, disappearing completely the emergency room, the maternity ward, the outpatient clinic, all of it, gone in the span of time. A city needed to decide that a neighborhood didn't generate enough revenue to keep its residents alive near a place that could heal them. Nadine transferred to a hospital 40 minutes from home by car. She didn't complain. She went. That was how the Hollis household worked. You go, you work, you come home, you feed your child, you go again. Nadine sent Faye $300 every month on the first Monday, so regularly that Faye could have set a clock by it, because Nadine knew the first Monday of the month was the day the rent withdrew automatically, and if the account was empty that day, the $35 penalty fee was the kind of money you didn't have, but the bank took anyway. Faye carried the first ultrasound photo in the left pocket of her thin Old Navy jacket, the 8-week picture, a tiny white dot in the middle of all that gray, a white crease running through the image because she had folded and unfolded it too many times. She didn't take it out often. She just kept it there, the way a person keeps proof that something is here, even when the whole world keeps asking what she plans to do. On Valentine's night, Faye went to St. Clement's private hospital for a routine prenatal checkup. It was the only hospital that still had a maternity ward within a 40-minute bus ride from Dorchester since the community hospital had closed. The doctor said the pregnancy was healthy. The baby's heartbeat was strong, right on schedule. The first good news in weeks. Faye walked out to the billing desk with the closest thing to relief she had felt all month. Then the system declined her. The screen showed an error code. Financial red flag. The clerk looked at the screen, looked at the clock, with her shift ending in 8 minutes, then called security. Dr. Fisk walked past, looked at the file, looked at the number, and said, "If you can't resolve the $400 deposit, contact the financial office on Monday." Today was Friday. Outside, it was 14 degrees below zero, and snow was falling. The last bus had passed 8 minutes earlier. Faye's phone had 4% battery left. Not enough to call Nadine, not enough to call for a ride, only enough to watch the screen darken in her hand like one last reminder that tonight she was completely alone. Connell entered the hospital again, not through the main lobby doors, but through the VIP entrance in the back, the door only people with meetings on the top floor even knew existed. He stepped into the private elevator, pressed the button for the highest floor, and when the doors opened, he walked straight to the chief financial officer's office, without knocking. The director was still sitting there, stacking papers from the meeting that had ended 10 minutes earlier, the meeting where Connell had sat on the opposite side of the table and approved the new charitable sponsorship, the money that kept this hospital lit in ways the board of directors would never put in an annual report. Connell stood in front of the desk. He didn't sit down. He didn't need to sit, because what he was about to say didn't require comfort. He said there was a woman 7 months pregnant standing outside on the hospital steps in the snow because his payment system had just rejected her. He would go outside. He would bring her in. He would clear every pending charge on her file. And he would make sure she didn't pay a single cent for any visit from now until she gave birth. He would do all of that within 5 minutes. I'm not saying this twice. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The director knew which money flowed into the hospital every quarter from Connell's charity fund. He knew how many people that money paid. He knew that if that stream stopped, there would be an audit, and the audit would find things no one wanted found. The director looked at Connell, looked at the desk, picked up the phone and called down to the lobby. 90 seconds later, a nurse ran out to the hospital steps where Faye was still standing. Faye didn't understand what was happening. 5 minutes earlier, she had been standing in the snow with her phone at 4% battery and no way to get home. And now a nurse was apologizing to her, leading her back inside, saying there had been a mistake in the system, that everything had been resolved, that she should come in and lie down so they could check her blood pressure again. She lay on the hospital bed, still wearing the black cashmere coat, far too large on her, the sleeves falling past her wrists, the scent of leather and a man's cologne she didn't recognize resting in the fabric, though her body registered it the way the body registers warmth before the mind can analyze where it came from. The nurse checked her blood pressure. asked if she needed water, asked if anyone was coming to pick her up. Faye lay still, both hands on her stomach, eyes on the ceiling, and thought that someone somewhere inside this building had just done something she didn't understand, and she didn't know whether she should feel grateful or afraid, and that not knowing sat in her chest at the same time as the baby's heartbeat pulsing beneath her palm. Connell stood in the hallway, without his coat, his bare arms cold because the heating system in a hospital corridor was never as warm as the patient rooms. He looked through the small glass pane in the door. He saw her sitting on the bed, both hands on her stomach, his coat draped over her shoulders as if it had always belonged there. He slipped his hand into his pants pocket. The folding knife was there, cold, the oak handle worn smooth where his thumb usually rested. He held it in his palm, didn't open it, didn't look at it, only felt its weight. And for the first time in 17 years, he understood why he'd kept this knife. Not because of Glenn, not because of anger, because it was proof that something left behind could still be here. Still in someone's hand, still not gone. He turned away, told Briggs to prepare an envelope. Cash, enough to pay her entire maternity cost, from now until the birth. No sender name, no phone number, no message. Briggs looked at him for 1 second, didn't ask, then nodded. The envelope was sent through the front desk 10 minutes later. Connell stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Briggs drove the Escalade out of the basement into the February night. The car was silent. Connell sat in the back seat and looked out through the glass. Snow cutting sideways through the streetlights in diagonal lines. And he was cold. His arms, his neck, his side where the wind slipped in through the gap in the car door. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt cold. Those two things didn't contradict each other. They simply existed at the same time inside the body of a man who had just given away the warmest thing he had and was now sitting in silence, without a coat, watching the city slide past the car window as if he were trying to remember the last time he did something without first calculating the consequences. 24 hours after Valentine's night, Briggs knocked on the penthouse door at 7 o'clock in the morning. He never knocked unless there was something Connell needed to know that couldn't be said over the phone. Connell opened the door, still wearing the clothes from the night before, still without sleep. Briggs placed a sheet of paper on the kitchen table. He had checked why the woman's insurance had been denied, not because Connell had asked him to, but because Briggs was the kind of man who finished a job before he was told to do it. The result was on that sheet of paper. Faye Hollis's credit file had been flagged red because a man named Troy Egan had listed her as his financial dependent when he borrowed $15,000 at heavy interest. Troy Egan. Connell knew that name, not directly, but in the way he knew hundreds of other names sitting inside Paxton's black-covered ledger, small debtors, the kind of loans the organization usually wrote off when the debtor disappeared, because the money spent finding the person cost more than the money lost. Troy Egan's debt was $15,000. In Connell's world, $15,000 was dinner at Faro. It was the tip Paxton paid a lawyer to make sure nothing was written into the record. It was a number no one in the organization bothered to look at twice. But that small number had spread. It spread from Paxton's black-covered ledger through Troy's financial file, through the federal credit system, through the health insurance algorithm, through the error code on the hospital billing desk screen, and finally into the hands of the St. Clement's receptionist on Friday night, Valentine's Day. At the exact moment a woman 7 months pregnant stood at the counter holding her insurance card and waiting. $15,000 in Connell's world meant almost nothing. $15,000 in Faye Hollis's world was the hospital steps at 5 o'clock in the evening, in the middle of falling snow. Connell sat at the kitchen table in the penthouse, looking out at the glass wall. The city below was waking up. Cars, lights, steam rising from the vents of old buildings, and he saw none of it except the calculation. His money flowed into St. Clement's every quarter through the charity fund. That money kept the hospital running. That hospital had just pushed a pregnant woman out into the snow. A debt in the ledger of his own organization had ruined her credit file. He had taken off his coat for her on the steps of the very building he helped build with dirty money. He had stepped outside into the snow like a man offering help, but now, sitting in the warm penthouse and looking down at the city, he saw his own shadow in the picture for the first time, and that shadow wasn't shaped like a rescuer. It was shaped like part of the system that had created the problem in the first place. He sat there for a long while. Briggs stood by the door, saying nothing. Then Connell stood, opened the drawer of his desk, took out the copy of the debt ledger he kept for himself, turned to the page with Troy Egan's name, and crossed out that line in black pen. Debt erased. Not through Paxton. Not through the system. Without notifying anyone, he crossed out the name of a debtor he had never met with his own hand, because that man's debt had reached a woman he had also never met until the night before. And because, for the first time in 17 years, Connell Sheridan looked into the system he had built and saw it doing exactly what it had been designed to do, crushing people without power, and he realized that he had become a larger, richer, more dangerous version of the men who had knocked on his door one January night and carried his father away. 3 days after Connell crossed Troy Egan's name out of the debt ledger, Paxton Greer knew everything, not because someone had told him, but because Paxton had his own system, a network of eyes and ears he had planted through every layer of the organization over 14 years, from the hospital receptionist to the underground bookkeepers to the very lieutenants who sat down to dinner with Connell every week. Paxton knew Connell had gone back to the hospital on Valentine's night, knew he had threatened the chief financial officer with the organization's leverage, and through a quiet alert in their own ledger system, knew he had erased Troy Egan's $15,000 debt with his own hand without going through anyone. Paxton wasn't angry. Paxton was never angry, because anger was an emotion, and emotion didn't have a line in the books. Paxton simply wrote one more line in the black-covered ledger, the final line he needed. The meeting took place in the basement of Faro, where meetings never appeared on anyone's calendar, and chairs were arranged around a long wooden table whose surface had gone dull from too many elbows and too many decisions made upon it. 6 lieutenants sat around the table. Connell sat at the head. Paxton sat opposite him. Paxton placed the black-covered ledger on the table, opened it, and began to read. He read slowly, line by line, amount by amount, date by date, in the even voice of a man reading a balance sheet rather than an indictment. Though in this room, those two things were one and the same. In the year 2022, forgiving the debt of the grocery store owner on Dot Ave, $8,000. In the year 2023, extending 3 more months to a debtor who had just had a child, $12,000 in lost interest. In the year 2024, dropping protection on the Southie laundromat, $3,600 a year. In February of the year 2024, threatening the hospital's chief financial officer with organizational leverage over a strange woman. That same week, erasing $15,000 in debt outside the system. Total losses over 4 years, $147,000. Paxton closed the ledger, looked at Connell, then said, without raising his voice, without lowering it, only with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this sentence in his mind many times before speaking it aloud, "I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying you're expensive. And in this business, expensive and wrong are the same thing." The room went silent. Connell looked around the table. 6 faces. No one looked at him. Each man was looking away in his own way. One down at the table, one into his glass of liquor, one at the wall, as if the wall held something more interesting than this moment. Connell knew that kind of looking. He had first seen it when he was 6 years old, sitting on the 3rd-floor stairway, when Mrs. Henderson walked past, looked at him, then looked away, when the young couple stepped over him, when the pizza delivery man glanced once and kept climbing. The same look, the same choice. To see and decide this wasn't your business. 30 years earlier, it had happened in an apartment hallway. Now it was happening in a restaurant basement, around a dull wooden table, among men in suits drinking expensive liquor. A different place, the exact same mechanism. Connell stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't tell them about the snowy night or the coat or the pregnant woman or the folding knife in his jacket pocket, the one he was holding at that moment in his left hand under the table. He only looked at Paxton and said, "That ledger records every time I stopped. Your ledger records every time you stepped over someone. At the end of your life, look back and see which one weighs more." Then he walked out. No one called him back. No one stood up to follow. He went down the basement hallway, up the stairs, through the kitchen where the chefs were preparing for the evening shift, and no one looked up. Out the back door, and into the Boston night in February. Briggs had parked there, engine running, headlights off. Connell opened the car door and got into the back seat without saying anything. Briggs said nothing either. The car pulled away from Faro, the restaurant where Connell had sat at the head of the table for the last 7 years, and he didn't look back. Connell wasn't kicked out of the organization. He walked out on his own. That difference mattered, because it was the difference between a man being pushed out by a system and a man looking straight at that system, then deciding he no longer wanted to stand inside it. After the night in the basement of Faro, Connell didn't call anyone, didn't meet anyone, didn't explain himself to anyone. He went back to the Seaport District penthouse, sat at the kitchen table, the 6-chair table, where only one chair was ever used, looked through the glass wall at the city slowly brightening, and understood that for 17 years he had built an empire, so he would never again have to sit on a stairway waiting for someone to open a door. But that empire was the very thing locking doors in other people's faces. He left over 3 days. No drama, no announcement. He simply stopped coming, stopped calling, stopped appearing in the places where his appearance had once been law. Paxton took over without firing a single shot, because Paxton had built the wall a long time ago and had only been waiting for Connell to step outside so he could close the door behind him. Briggs followed Connell 1 week later. No one asked him to leave. He simply stopped showing up at the depot on Monday morning, and no one called to ask why, because Paxton knew Briggs knew too much, and that kind of knowledge was the best life insurance a person could have in this world. Connell kept enough money to live for 6 months, a sum Briggs had helped him hide separately over the past 5 years. Not because Briggs had predicted this day, but because Briggs was the kind of man who always prepared for every door, including the emergency exit. Not rich, not poor. Enough to rent an apartment in Dorchester, 4 blocks from South Boston. Close enough to the neighborhood where he had grown up, that when he stood at the window and looked out, he saw the same street corner, the same bare February trees, the same laundromat on the first floor that was now a nail salon. 17 years, millions of dollars, half the city in his hands, and in the end, he came back to the exact place where he had started, looking at that same street, that same stairway, a circle. He called Ruth at 3 o'clock in the morning, on his first night in the new apartment. Ruth picked up after the first ring. She didn't ask why he was calling at 3 o'clock in the morning, because Ruth knew a phone ringing at 3 o'clock in the morning from her son wasn't good news. But it also wasn't the worst news, because the worst news didn't come through a ringing phone. It came through a knock at the door, and Ruth knew that better than anyone. "I quit my job, Ma." He used the word job. They both knew it wasn't a job. But that was the word they used, had always used, because Ruth had washed her son's blood-stained clothes 5 years before when he said he'd been cut at the garage, and she had washed them without asking, because Ruth knew there were questions that, once asked, would break something that could never be repaired, and she had chosen to keep that thing whole for 17 years. Why? I stopped for one person. Then I realized I was part of the reason she needed someone to stop. Silence. Longer than usual. Longer than any silence that had ever stood between mother and son in all their 36 years. Then Ruth asked, in a different voice, not the voice of a woman offering philosophy or a mother teaching her child, but the voice of a woman who had lain awake every night for 17 years with the phone on her pillow, waiting for a ring or a knock at the door. "You left that place?" "I did, Ma." "Really left?" "Really?" Then Connell heard something he had never heard over the phone in all his 36 years as Ruth Sheridan's son. Ruth cried. Not a sob, not a sniffle, only the way her breathing changed, turning wetter, heavier, like the air before rain. Ruth cried because Ruth had known, had always known. She had known from the first time Connell came home in a new shirt that dock work wages couldn't buy. She had known when he moved to the Seaport District, the kind of place no one from South Boston moved to on a legal salary. She had sent him books every Christmas, a different one each year, as if books might keep her son on this side of a line she didn't dare name. She had lain awake every night, not because she couldn't sleep, but because she was waiting, and what she had been waiting for was exactly this call, the 3 o'clock in the morning call where her son said really left, and now the thing she had been holding inside her chest for 17 years was finally allowed to fall out. "Eat something, son." "I will." They both knew he wouldn't eat. But that sentence wasn't about eating. It was about Ruth still being his mother and Connell still being her son. And some things didn't change, even when the world around them had changed completely. While Connell was sitting in the Dorchester apartment, calling Ruth at 3 o'clock in the morning, on the other side of the city, Faye Hollis was living through the days after Valentine's night with a coat she didn't take off. She wore it every day. She wore it to school. She wore it to the supermarket. She wore it on the bus to her internship shifts. The black cashmere coat, far too large, its sleeves falling past her wrists, unable to zip over her 8th-month pregnant belly, which was growing with the urgency of something almost ready. She didn't wash it. The scent had faded, but it was still there. The smell of leather, of a man's cologne, of a car seat, the smell of a life she knew nothing about, except for the weight of it on her shoulders each morning when she put it on. She moved the ultrasound photo from the left pocket of her Old Navy jacket to the left pocket of the cashmere coat. A small act she did without thinking, the way people move the most important thing they have into the safest place available to them. Then one evening, when she slipped her hand into the right pocket looking for change for bus fare, her fingers touched a small piece of paper. A receipt. Faro, Seaport District. February 14th. 3:12 in the afternoon. 2 espressos. $14. $50 tip. She held the receipt under the bus light and read every line. 2 espressos, $14, and a $50 tip. Who tipped $50 on $14 of coffee? And why had that person been at Faro at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Valentine's Day, then 2 hours later standing in front of a hospital, taking off his coat for a stranger? The receipt didn't tell her who he was, but it told her where he had been. 1 week later, on a Sunday afternoon, Faye went to Faro. B kicked inside her belly as she stepped through the door. The restaurant was finer than any place she had ever entered. The kind of restaurant where the menu didn't list prices, because if you needed to know the price, you shouldn't be there. She wore the cashmere coat, 8 months pregnant, walked straight to the counter, and asked for the manager. Had anyone come here on the afternoon of February 14th? A man, drinking espresso, leaving a $50 tip? The manager looked at her, then looked at the coat, and in the moment he recognized that coat, his face changed. Not obvious fear, but the kind of change that happens when someone recognizes an object belonging to a person they know, and that knowing comes with caution. The manager said, "I don't give out customer information." But the way he said it, faster than necessary, his eyes dropping and then shifting aside, told Faye more than any answer could have. The man who owned this coat wasn't the kind of person restaurant managers gave information about when asked. He was the kind of person restaurant managers went silent about when asked. Faye walked out of Faro and stopped looking, not because she was afraid, because she understood that some answers would find their way to her on their own, and she only needed to live long enough to be in the right place when they came. April. 4 o'clock in the morning. The pain came not like pain, but like pressure, the kind of pressure that rises from somewhere deep and doesn't negotiate. Nadine arrived in 25 minutes, ran 2 red lights, didn't slow down at any turn, driving on the reflexes of a woman who had worked as an emergency room nurse for 15 years and knew every second was the distance between okay and not okay. The hospital was blazing with light, the kind of light that only exists in hospitals and kitchens at 3 o'clock in the morning and in places where things begin or end. Faye lay on the bed, Nadine holding her hand, and she did the things she had spent the whole year preparing to help other people do, only to discover that preparing for something and living through it were 2 completely different things. Then there was a moment of silence, the kind of silence only a delivery room has, the kind of silence right before a human being begins to exist. Then came a cry that wasn't hers. B. 3 kilograms, eyes closed, 2 little hands curled into tiny fists, as if the girl had entered this world with a readiness to fight that she had inherited from her mother. Nadine held her granddaughter, looked at her for a long time, then said, "She looks like she already knows everything." Faye laughed, the exhausted kind of laugh that only comes after hours of work unlike any other work, because the result of it was lying in her mother's arms, breathing, alive, and seeing light for the first time. The cashmere coat was folded on the chair beside the bed. She had worn it to the hospital, taken it off when she changed into the hospital gown, and folded it exactly the way it had once been folded. It lay there on the chair beside B's bassinet, and Faye looked at it, then at her daughter, then back at it again. And for the first time since Valentine's night, she didn't think about what had happened. She thought about the person who had made it happen. Not her, him, the man who had taken off his coat in the snow, whose face she had never clearly seen. She whispered, not to Nadine, not to B, but to the room, to the coat, to the man who wasn't there. "I'm going to find him." While Faye was lying in the hospital, looking at the cashmere coat on the chair and promising the room that she would find him, Connell Sheridan was sitting in the Dorchester apartment doing nothing. 3 weeks. Not 3 weeks of rest, or 3 weeks of planning, but 3 weeks of a man who had spent 17 years knowing exactly who he was every morning, and now woke up not knowing. He sat at the small kitchen table, drank black coffee, and looked out the window at the same street corner where he had grown up. The laundromat on the first floor was now a nail salon. The steps in front of the building were still those same steps, the same concrete, the same crack he remembered with the palm of his hand, because he had sat there for 3 hours when he was 6 years old. 17 years walking in a circle, only to come back to the exact same place. In the 4th week, Briggs knocked on the door. No call beforehand. Briggs never called beforehand because calling beforehand meant giving a person the chance to say no, and Briggs hadn't come to be turned away. He brought a set of car repair tools with him, not a fancy set, but the kind bought at an auto parts store: wrenches, pliers, screwdrivers, motor oil, all neatly arranged in a metal box. He set it in front of Connell's apartment door and said, "The old man's Buick downstairs has been making noise since last week." Then he went down to the lot behind the building, where Walt's Buick was parked, lifted the hood, and started looking into the engine. Connell stood at the window and looked down, watched Briggs bending over the hood, watched for 20 minutes. Then he went down the stairs, out to the lot, and stood beside Briggs looking into the engine. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, and after a while his hand moved on its own into the toolbox to take a wrench, because fixing cars was something he had known how to do since he was 17 in South Boston. Back when, if you didn't have money to pay a mechanic, you became the mechanic yourself. Walt, 70 years old, a retired mechanic from the first floor, came out and watched the 2 men bent over his Buick for 20 minutes, then said nothing, went back inside, got his own toolbox, came out again, and sat down beside them. 3 men fixing a car in silence. That was the beginning. Good word spread the way good word always spreads in neighborhoods where people still talk to one another, quickly and specifically. Walt told the woman on the 3rd floor. The woman on the 3rd floor told her daughter-in-law in the building next door. And by the end of the 2nd week, there were 4 cars parked in the lot behind the building waiting for Connell to look at them. But then Connell realized that the people bringing cars to him didn't have car problems. They had road problems. Mrs. Callahan on the 5th floor, 71 years old, had missed 3 blood pressure appointments at the clinic because the bus was late, and the clinic wouldn't hold a spot for more than 15 minutes. Floyd, a veteran, needed to get to the VA hospital every Friday, living at the mercy of whichever bus route happened to run on time that day, and the answer was usually none of them. Gina, a single mother whose son had asthma, had to get to a clinic on the west side of the city. 2 buses, 1 hour and 20 minutes if everything went smoothly. And in Boston, everything going smoothly wasn't a promise. It was a hope. Connell started driving. Not in a luxury car, but in the Ford sedan. Walt lent him because Walt had decided he was too old to drive, and that the car was better off with someone who used it for something useful. And Connell started writing things down, but not in a new notebook. He used the black-covered ledger, the very ledger he had taken from the meeting table the night he walked out of Faro. The ledger Paxton had used to record every time Connell went soft, every amount he forgave, every door he held open when he was supposed to shut it. Connell turned the pages, looked at Paxton's handwriting, neat, exact, cold. Then he took a pen, crossed out each line, and wrote over it. The old ledgers that once recorded cold penalties and calculated losses were now replaced with schedules for the living. Where Paxton had written mathematical debts, Connell wrote down the names of people who simply needed a ride to survive. Across those marked-out pages, names like Mrs. Callahan, Floyd, and Gina took the place of numbers, transforming a book of guilt into a logbook of hope. The ledger wasn't erased. It was rewritten. 8 to 10 people each week. Connell drove, Briggs drove, and sometimes Walt sat in the passenger seat giving directions, because he had known every alley in Dorchester since the year 1978. No charge, no name for what they were doing. Connell simply did the thing in front of him, because it was in front of him, and because not doing it was no longer something he knew how to live with. In August, months after Valentine's night, Faye stood in front of the Dorchester Community Clinic on a Tuesday morning, Bee in a fabric carrier against her chest, the black cashmere coat draped over her arm, even though it was a sweltering summer day outside, because Faye had carried that coat everywhere since the February night, the way some people carry an umbrella in sunshine, not because they fear rain, but because of habit, or because they believe in something they haven't named yet. She had graduated in May and was doing her clinical internship at the clinic 3 days a week, taking in patients, assisting with prenatal exams, learning the rhythm of a community clinic, which wasn't the rhythm of a hospital, because hospitals were fast and community clinics were slow at the pace of the people they served. People who had grown used to waiting for everything else in life. So they waited here too, even though this was the one place that shouldn't make them wait. That morning, she was waiting for Mrs. Callahan, 71 years old, high blood pressure, scheduled for a reading every 2 weeks, who had missed her last appointment because the bus didn't come. Faye stepped outside to see whether the woman was walking from the bus stop and saw an old Ford sedan parked in front of the clinic, the kind of car that was clean but not new, the kind people bought because it ran, not because it was beautiful. The driver sat still inside, his face hidden behind the windshield. The rear passenger door opened, and a man stepped out from the front passenger seat, walked around to the back, and opened the door for Mrs. Callahan. She stepped out slowly, holding a small purse, and the man supported her elbow with one hand while keeping the car door open with the other. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't say, "Hurry up," or "I can't park here long," or any of the things people say when they're doing you a favor and want you to know they're doing you a favor. He just stood there, waiting for Mrs. Callahan to adjust her purse, waiting until she was ready, with the specific patience of someone for whom waiting wasn't a sacrifice, but a way of existing. Faye looked at his hands, not his face first, but his hands, the way his hand held Mrs. Callahan's elbow, steady but not tight, just enough for her to know someone was there without making her feel weak. And she recognized him, not by seeing his face, but by the way the body remembers feeling. Those same hands, that same firmness without roughness, had placed a cashmere coat over her shoulders in the snow 6 months earlier, without saying a word. She hadn't seen his face clearly that night, because it was dark and snow was falling and she had been looking down at the steps, then at his shoulder from the hospital bed, then at the ceiling. She didn't recognize his face. She recognized his hands. Mrs. Callahan walked into the clinic, nodding hello to Faye as she passed, never knowing that the nurse standing in the doorway had forgotten how to breathe. The man turned back toward the car. He had taken 3 steps when he saw Faye standing at the clinic door. He looked at her. Didn't recognize her. Why would he? He had met her once, in the snow, at night, for less than 5 minutes. And she was only one of thousands of faces the city pushed through his life every day. Then his eyes moved from her face down to her arm, where the black cashmere coat was draped, too wide, too long, too expensive for anything else she was wearing, the white scrubs, the old sneakers, the fabric carrier against her chest. He stopped. Faye said, her voice calmer than she felt. "You stopped that night, at St. Clement's." He looked at the coat, looked at her, then looked at the thing she was holding against her chest in the fabric carrier. B. 4 months old, eyes open, watching him with a seriousness far too large for 4 months of life, her 2 little hands closed into fists the size of plums. Connell looked at the baby, looked for a long time. His right hand slipped into his pants pocket, where the folding knife rested, the oak handle worn smooth, and he held it in his palm not because he needed it, but because it was what he always held when he didn't know what to do with his hands, when his body needed to anchor itself to something familiar, in a moment when everything else was new. He didn't take the knife out. He only held it, felt its weight. Silence stretched between the 2 of them and the baby, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled because it was holding something larger than any sentence could say. Then Connell said, softly, almost to himself, almost not words but breath given shape, "She looks warm." 2 words, and Faye heard them not with her ears, but in the way you hear something from a person when everything in their voice tells you they don't say this kind of thing often, that the sentence comes from somewhere deeper than this morning, deeper than the hospital, deeper than the coat, that this sentence had lived inside him for a very long time before she ever existed. "She looks warm." The words were a quiet echo, reaching backward to the kindness of a laundromat owner 30 years earlier, a striking contrast to the freezing stairway of his own childhood. "Nobody should sit out here alone, kid." He had seen someone standing in the cold and had given her the warmest thing he had, and now he was looking at her daughter asleep in a fabric carrier in the August air, warm, safe, with the casual peace of someone who had never known what cold was. They sat in the clinic staff room, a small room with 1 table, 2 chairs, a mini fridge humming in the corner, and a fluorescent light flickering near the ceiling that no one fixed, because a community clinic was the kind of place where small things never got repaired, because there was always something bigger that needed the money more. Faye sat on one side, nursing B, a cloth draped over her shoulder, while B, 4 months old, ate with the absolute concentration of someone whose entire world, for the moment, consisted of exactly one thing. Connell sat across from her, his back straight, his hands on the table, and between them lay the black-covered ledger. He opened it to the new pages, the pages where he had written over Paxton's words, patient names, addresses, appointment times, clinic phone numbers. Faye looked at the ledger, the old leather cover, the diagonal scratch across one corner, the kind of notebook that wasn't sold in office supply stores, the kind anyone could look at and know it had been in the hands of someone who did things ordinary people didn't do. She didn't ask where the ledger came from. She read the names. Mrs. Callahan, Tuesday and Thursday. Floyd, Friday. Gina and her son, Monday. She stopped. 4 names in Connell's ledger matched 4 patients in her clinic system. Mrs. Callahan, whom she had just checked in that morning. Floyd, whom she had called last week to remind him of his appointment. Gina, whose son's file sat on Faye's desk every Monday. She looked up, he looked at her, and both of them understood at the same time, without needing to say it, that they had been standing on opposite sides of the same gap for months without knowing it. He had filled that gap with a Ford sedan and a black-covered ledger. She had seen that gap through missed patient appointments and empty slots on the clinic schedule. The same problem. 2 angles of sight. Faye said, in the voice of someone who had been thinking about this for longer than just this morning, that there was a federal model for this kind of thing, a community medical transportation program that had been tested in other cities, funded by private nonprofit organizations, with an organizational structure that already existed and worked when someone was willing to do the labor of putting the pieces together. Connell listened. He listened the way he always listened, carefully, without interrupting, arranging each piece of information the way hands arrange engine parts. Then he said, not as an objection, only as the truth, I've never built anything the police weren't interested in. Faye looked at him. She wasn't shocked. She didn't widen her eyes or push her chair back or do any of the things people do in movies when they hear someone admit something like that. She had known, or at least suspected, since that Sunday afternoon at Faro, when the manager looked at the coat and his face changed in the way a face only changes when it recognizes something belonging to someone you don't want to name. Faye grew up in Dorchester. She knew what kind of person made restaurant managers go silent. She knew what kind of coat cost $4,000. She knew, and she was still sitting here, nursing her daughter, looking at him across the table, because Faye had lived long enough with a man who talked a lot and did little to understand that a confession didn't matter as much as the question that came after it. She asked, "Do you want to start?" Connell looked at her, looked at B nursing, looked at the black-covered ledger lying open on the table between them. Yes. That night, Connell called Ruth. She picked up after the first ring, as always, because Ruth was the kind of mother who kept her phone within reach, even though her son was 36 years old and no longer needed her the way he once had. She was sitting in the kitchen in South Boston, the same kitchen where she had paid bills after the children were asleep for 20 years. A cup of tea in front of her, the chipped mug she had kept for 12 years because it held heat better than the others, and because Ruth didn't throw away anything that could still be used. Connell told her. He told her about the clinic, about the woman he had given his coat to on Valentine's night, about how she was still wearing that coat 6 months later, about the baby named B, 4 months old, lying in a fabric carrier and looking at him with eyes more serious than anyone he had ever met. He told her about the black-covered ledger and the 4 matching names. He told her about the question the woman had asked and the answer he had given. Ruth listened. She didn't interrupt. She listened the way Ruth always listened, completely, with her whole body, while the tea in front of her slowly went cold because she had forgotten it was there. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she asked, "Do you know the laundromat woman?" "No, Ma. I never knew her name. She made you cocoa from an almost empty tin of powder with hot water from the sink faucet because she didn't have milk in the laundromat. Do you know how much that cost?" "No. It didn't cost anything. It cost the only thing worth spending, time and attention. The men who walked out on us didn't have that willingness in their hearts. Your father couldn't find it, and Troy didn't have it for his own little girl. But the laundromat woman had it. And now, Connell, you have it too. You're not like your father, Connell. You're like the laundromat woman. You're the person with almost no cocoa left who still makes the cup. Silence. Long. The kind of silence where both people feel each other through the line not by words, but by breath. Then Ruth said 2 words, in a voice Connell had never heard from his mother before. Not the voice of a woman teaching, not the voice of a woman worrying, but the voice of a woman who had finally seen her son standing in the place she had prayed for 17 years he would one day stand. Build it, son. They built it in 4 months. Faye wrote the grant proposal on the kitchen table in her Dorchester studio, with Bee sleeping in a bassinet 1 meter away, her laptop propped on a stack of nursing textbooks she hadn't had time to return to the school library. She had never written a proposal in her life. She learned by reading what other people had done, then doing it herself, then correcting the mistakes as she went, the way she had learned almost everything since Troy vanished and left her 7 months pregnant with a credit file burned black behind her. She found the models, community medical transportation programs in Michigan, volunteer driver networks in Missouri, private nonprofit grants for low-income communities that had lost access to medical care because hospitals had closed. She wrote a proposal for a program based out of the Dorchester Clinic, volunteer cars, a simple dispatch system, a per-ride cost lower than 1/3 of the cost of non-emergency ambulance transportation. Connell recruited drivers, not by posting online or putting flyers up at the supermarket, but the way he had always found people, through familiarity, through trust, through knowing who had a car that ran and time no one was paying them for, and a very specific willingness to do something without wages, because that thing mattered more than wages. Briggs 3 days a week, because Briggs had followed Connell for 12 years, and stopping wasn't part of his skill set. Corbin 2 days, the only lieutenant who left the organization with Connell, not because Corbin hated Paxton, but because Corbin was the kind of man who followed people, not structures, and when the person left, the structure could no longer hold him. Walt drove on weekends, because Walt was 70 years old, and on weekends he had nothing to do except sit and look out the window, and driving someone to a medical appointment was much better than sitting and looking out the window. Then 4 more people. Each one had a past they didn't write on an application. A former protection enforcer who now worked security at an elementary school, who knew every alley in Dorchester because he had once collected money in every one of those alleys. A former delivery driver for the organization, who knew what roads were jammed at what hour, and which ones stayed open because he had once had to deliver things on time when being late meant there was a problem. A plumber who had once been a debt collector, who knew half the neighborhood's addresses because he had once knocked on all those doors. And one more man, quiet, dependable, the kind of person you didn't ask what he used to do because the answer wouldn't make you comfortable, but his presence now did. 7 people, each one using the very skills the past had given them, knowing the roads, knowing the neighborhood, knowing what hours were safe, knowing how to speak to older people without making them feel like a burden, but for a different purpose. They called the program Open Door, because every door should open. In the first month, they served 33 patients. Mrs. Callahan got to her blood pressure appointments on time. Floyd got to the VA hospital on Friday. Gina and her son got to the asthma clinic on Monday. The clinic's missed appointment rate dropped 18%. It wasn't a miracle. It was a logistics problem that someone had finally treated like a logistics problem instead of blaming patients for not showing up. Then the program made the local news. A short segment, former businessman and nurse build patient transportation program in Dorchester. The camera showed Connell sitting in a car, Faye, at the clinic, Mrs. Callahan stepping out of the car smiling. The reporter didn't know what former businessman really meant. Paxton Greer did. Paxton watched the news from the VIP room at Faro, where he now sat at the head of the table, and saw Connell's face on the screen, a face the FBI could recognize, a face that knew enough things to bury Paxton for 30 years. Paxton sent a message through Briggs. Not a direct threat, but polite in the way politeness in this world meant threat. Tell him that a face on TV isn't good for anyone's health. Anyone's. Briggs gave the message to Connell. Connell read it, stayed silent for a while. Then that night, while Faye was folding Bee's clothes in the studio, he told her, not everything, enough. That he had once been the kind of man restaurant managers feared when they saw his coat. That the black-covered ledger had once recorded something else, before he wrote patient names over it. That there was someone who didn't want him appearing on TV, and that person wasn't the kind of man you ignored. Faye listened. She didn't run. She didn't forgive him because there was nothing for her to forgive. She wasn't the one harmed by that past. She didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't okay. She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had lived with Troy Egan long enough to know the difference between men who said the right words while doing the wrong things, and men who did the right thing at the wrong time. And Connell was the second kind. And the second kind was someone she could work with. She said, "You stopped for me that night. I'm stopping for you now. We'll handle it." Connell met Paxton at Faro. He chose Faro because that was where everything had begun, where he had sat at the head of the table for 7 years, where the receipt with the $50 tip for 2 espressos had been inside the pocket of the cashmere coat before it fell into the hands of a pregnant woman in Dorchester, and because Connell was the kind of man who closed circles. He arrived first, sat at the table by the window, ordered espresso. Paxton arrived on time because Paxton was always on time, precision being the only thing Paxton truly trusted. He sat down across from him, ordered the same thing, and the two men sat looking at each other over 2 small cups of coffee in a restaurant both of them knew far too well. Connell spoke first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lower it. He spoke with the calm of a man who had spent 3 weeks preparing exactly 1 sentence, and knew that sentence only needed to be said once. "You've got a ledger recording every time I went soft. I've got 17 years of memory recording every amount you hid, every call you erased, every name you made disappear. If I stay quiet, I stay quiet. But if anyone comes near that clinic, near that woman, near that child, then my ledger opens. And you know mine is thicker than yours." Paxton looked at him, for a long time, not with the look of a man judging, or the look of a man getting angry, but with the look of a man weighing the calculation he had weighed his entire life. How much gain, how much damage, and which number was larger? Paxton knew Connell wasn't bluffing. 17 years, sitting in the same car, at the same table, in the same meeting rooms, and Connell knew every sum of money Paxton had hidden off the books, every call Paxton had deleted from his phone, every name Paxton had made disappear without going through Connell. Paxton's ledger recorded $147,000 in Connell's softness. The ledger inside Connell's head recorded things that, if opened, wouldn't cost Paxton money, but freedom. Paxton drank his coffee, set the cup down, stood up, walked out without saying a word. After that night, no one came near the clinic. No one came near Faye. No one came near B. That silence lasted for months, and then years. Not the kind of silence that came from peace, but the kind of silence that came from balance. The kind of peace that existed not because both sides trusted each other, but because both sides were holding knives, and both sides knew the other blade was sharper than they had thought. 2 years after the night, Paxton drank his coffee and stood up from the table at Faro without saying a word. Open Door had 5 cars, 11 volunteers, and served 2 clinics in South Boston. Smaller than the programs funded by the state with millions of dollars, but large enough for those 33 patients in the first month to become more than 100 patients a month now, and real enough that every name in the black-covered ledger was a person who got to the doctor on time instead of sitting at a bus stop waiting for a bus that never came. Connell still drove 3 days a week. He didn't have to drive. He could have only coordinated, only managed, only sat behind a desk. But Connell was the kind of man who didn't stop doing the work just because he was organizing it, because sitting behind a desk without holding the steering wheel was like cooking without tasting. You lost the only thing that told you whether the dish was right. The dispatch room was Walt's repaired garage, a desk, a phone, a large whiteboard Walt had found at a school clearing out storage, and a hook on the wall beside the door, the kind of iron hook bought at a hardware store for $2. Hanging on that $2 hook was the black cashmere coat, $4,000, tailored in Milan. Faye had returned it on the day Open Door officially opened. She had washed it, ironed it, folded it exactly the way it had once been folded, then handed it to him with both hands and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Connell held it, felt its weight, the weight of something that had traveled farther than he had imagined, and come back changed in the way all things change once they have been needed. He didn't wear it again. He walked to the wall, hung it on the $2 hook, and it had stayed there ever since, in the small garage beside the whiteboard, and the schedules, and the clinic phone numbers written in marker. The coat no longer belonged to him. It no longer belonged to her. It was the first thing that belonged to this room. In the drawer of Connell's desk, beside the black-covered ledger now filled with patient names and appointment times, lay the folding knife with the oak handle carved with the initials G.S. For the first time in 17 years, it wasn't in the pocket of his suit jacket. It was on the desk, in the place where he worked, in the place where he had chosen to stand. His father's knife, the ledger that had been rewritten, and the coat hanging on the wall. 3 objects from 3 different seasons of his life, all in the same room, not thrown away, but placed where they finally belonged. Connell and Faye ate lunch in the clinic staff room every day Faye worked. Bee sat on Faye's lap, 2 years old now, looking at everything with a seriousness that often unsettled adults, because it seemed as if the child were judging them. Faye left a paper bag sandwich on Connell's desk every morning, without saying anything, without reminding him, simply placing it there, because she knew he forgot to eat, if no one reminded him, and she reminded him not with words, but with a paper bag appearing in the right place at the right time every day. Ruth sent 2 books every Christmas now, because she knew there was one more reader. Bee called Connell Con, because she had heard Faye call him that on the phone with Ruth and copied it, and no one corrected her, and that lack of correction was the way the 3 of them said, "We're family," without anyone needing to say it aloud. Ruth came to Boston in November. Greyhound bus, because Ruth didn't like flying, and because a bus ticket was $35 while a plane ticket was $180, and Ruth had lived her whole life knowing the difference between those 2 numbers. She arrived at Walt's garage, where Connell was standing beside the Ford sedan with engine oil on his hands, talking to Faye about the next day's ride schedule. Ruth stood in the garage doorway and looked at her son, looked at the way he spoke, in a voice she had never heard in all her 38 years as his mother. The voice of a man who was no longer holding something tightly in his coat pocket, the voice of someone who had set the knife down on the desk and discovered that his hands were lighter than he had thought. She held Bee. Bee looked at her with those serious eyes, the eyes Nadine had said looked like she already knows everything. And Ruth looked back, for a long time, with the patience of a woman who had once stood in the doorway of a laundromat at 11 o'clock at night, 30 years earlier, with a face that was not horror, but confirmation. Ruth looked at her granddaughter, looked at her son, looked at the cashmere coat hanging on the $2 hook beside the whiteboard. Then she said, softly, in the voice only Ruth had, the voice of 20 years of night shifts, and breakfast with eggs if there were eggs and oatmeal if there weren't, the voice of 2 locked bolts and a phone on her pillow every night. "She's warm, Connell." 3 words. And in those 3 words, there was everything. There was the 6-year-old boy sitting on the cold stairway. There was the laundromat woman making cocoa with tap water. There were the 5 words the boy never forgot. There was the woman standing on the hospital steps in the snow. There was the $4,000 coat placed over a stranger's shoulders. There was the black-covered ledger with patient names written over debtor names. There was every door Connell had opened. And there was the 2-year-old child in her grandmother's arms, warm, safe, knowing nothing yet of snow or stairways or coats. And she would know one day, when she was old enough to understand that the world doesn't always stop for you, but sometimes, if someone is paying attention, it does. Connell and Faye's story isn't a story about the Mafia, or a hospital, or a coat. It's a story about the moment when one person sees someone in need and decides not to look away. You've been in those hospital waiting rooms. You've seen doors close in someone's face. Maybe you were the one the door closed on. Maybe you were the nurse hiding behind the counter. Maybe you were the man looking down at his phone. The question isn't whether you would stop. That question is too easy to answer from where you're sitting. The question is when you are looking away without even knowing you're looking away. Because there is always someone standing outside the door. There is always someone missing exactly what you have too much of. There is always a moment when the door hasn't fully closed yet, and you still have time. You don't need to save anyone. You only need to know when you're looking away. Because that other place, the place you look toward instead, you'll have to live there forever. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories every day. Please like and share this video with the people you think need to hear it today. We'd love to know how this story made you feel, who it reminded you of, what moment in your own life it brought back to you. Please share it with us in the comments below, because every comment you leave is a story we want to hear from deep inside your heart. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again.